everyone. We thought we would try something new this year. So I've got our team of journalists from AgFunderNews on the line, and we're going to have a little chat about what has happened over 2025 and a little sneak peek at what we're thinking is coming up for 2026 in Agrifoodtech. And so 2025 has certainly been a bit of an odd year all round, as I'm sure many people would agree. We thought at the end of last year that we were looking at a bit of a bottoming out in terms of funding levels for startups in the industry. Unfortunately, looking ahead, we're starting to prepare for our global report, which comes out in the new year. And it looks like we are seeing some further declines in funding across the sector. This is appearing and happening in pretty much every single category, every single market globally. There's a couple of highlight spots in Europe. So unfortunately, there has been, there's been this decline. There's been a bit of a flight to quality. We are seeing some really large rounds for some interesting startups, and investment is very diverse across the categories. So if you look at the top funding deals, we're looking at top deals in e-grocery yet again, but also agriculture marketplaces and fintech, ag biotech, bioenergy, biomaterials. So I think, it's an interesting year. It's a bit of a transition year, I'd say. And maybe things might start to look a little bit more settled next year. We'll have Elaine Watson, our global foodtech editor, and Jenn Marston, our global agtech editor. And I'm just going to turn to them and ask them to share some of their insights of the year past. Elaine, do you want to kick things off?
Thank you, Louisa. Absolutely. I would say I'm going to talk a bit about alt protein because it's just been such a brutal year in this space. Recently, Believer Meats in the cultivated meat space abruptly ceasing operations. I'm still trying to get to the bottom of exactly what went wrong, but clearly this isn't good news for the whole sector. And then we've had the meltdown at Meaty, another well-funded player in the alt protein space. Been another torrid year for Beyond Meat, which has recently restructured its debt, but arguably just kind of kicked the can down the road. And then there's, of course, Mioko's in the alt dairy space, which became insolvent and was then auctioned off to the highest bidder. I would say, all of these cases are kind of different, but, stepping back to say, looking at the alt meat space specifically, I think, many firms have kind of focused on fixing long-term structural problems in the industry, but failed to come up with a compelling argument to consumers or industry partners in the short term, especially if they're asking people to pay a premium, which you're generally going to be until you can build any scale. This is, a particular challenge in cultivated meat, so full disclosure, I'm a huge fan of the concept. If you think that it's unnatural, I can assure you there's nothing very natural about the industrialized animal agriculture industry. And, maybe in 20, 30 years, we'll all be looking back and saying, how did we ever slaughter animals on this, vast scale for our meat? But right now, I don't really understand the value proposition to the consumer, especially as the first wave of products are kind of unstructured ingredients, cell biomass going into low value processed products like meatballs and nuggets, where price is everything. And what problem is this solving for consumers or the industry right now? Such products are unlikely to appeal to vegans or vegetarians because they've got animal cells. The message to meat eaters and flexitarians is kind of hard to articulate, and the sustainability message isn't clear yet on products such as chicken, at least. The ethical message is a hard sell. The health message is kind of confusing, and the economics are really challenging. So, and just finally, I guess on the plant-based meat side, everyone's got a pet theory about what went wrong, right? It's too processed, it's too expensive, it's too different to meat or not different enough. But I think the simpler explanation is just that we maybe just overestimated consumer demand. There is a demand there. It just isn't going up in the hockey stick, way that we thought it was maybe 3 or 4 years ago. And I personally don't really buy Ethan Brown at Beyond Meat. His argument that the meat lobby has kind of poisoned the well against alt meat. My sense is that consumers aren't against plant-based meat. Well, maybe JB Vance is, but people are just not that excited about it either. It's solving a problem most consumers, again, don't really have. If you want to cut down on red meat, you'll probably switch to chicken, not a Beyond Burger. So, and ultimately, why would you pay twice as much for something that's half as good?
Yeah, no, really good point. But on the cultivated meat side of things, looking at it as like a sort of investment category, do you think that, given what you've just mentioned about kind of the long-term overview, of potential of the sector, do you think that there's going to be just a few players remain, or do you think this is an overall permanent retreat from this category?
I mean, that's above my pay grade, Louisa, but I mean, there are definitely, I think the three best funded players, one of them has just arguably collapsed, and the other two have kind of retreated and retrenched, if you like. So that's Good Meat, owned by Eat Just, and then Upside Foods, which is scaled back. So, I'm not writing off the whole sector, but I think it's just going to be extremely challenging in the short term before you get to scale. As in any industry, you have to charge a premium. And at the moment, the kinds of products that are on offer do not warrant a premium, because we're talking about sell by a mass as opposed to kind of structured products. There are some players in the space, such as Vow in Australia, which has got 20,000 litre bioreactors that are up and running, and it's got a more premium product. So I'm quite interested to see where they go. But again, the market for cultivated quail may be fairly niche, but maybe that's an interesting place to begin. There's some other players like Blue Nalu doing high value products like bluefin tuna. So again, I think, I'm not writing the whole sector off, but it's extremely challenging at the moment. And again, it sours investor sentiment when the top funded players, are spending all of this money and at the moment not really having a great deal to show for it. But at the same time, this is a completely new industry, right? It didn't even exist 10 years ago. Look how long it took the mainstream meat industry to mature and so on. So I think in the next couple of years, yes, it's not looking too promising, but who knows, honestly, in 10, 20 years time, the second wave of players that's learned from the first, there may be a market here. And meanwhile, the ecosystem has been developing. There are developments in bioreactors, in cell culture media, in cell lines and so on. So I just think it's not the case that we're going to see some, action in the next year or two. It's going to be a longer term play.
Yeah, and a good point to talk a bit about the ecosystem and the enabling technologies that could be developed along with this, which may seem outside of food and agriculture at this point, but may end up coming in and being useful, potentially being used for other applications.
Yeah. I mean, we're seeing some players also that were in that enabling ecosystem that have kind of pivoted temporarily to biopharma. Maybe they're producing growth factors or something like that for cultivated meat, and they're looking at other more lucrative sectors at the moment. But again, the technology is there, so maybe as the cultivated meat sector picks up, then these technologies are available to that sector in future.
Do you think that you mentioned when you were talking about plant-based meat that one explanation would be that we overestimated consumer excitement and consumer desire for it? So if we think about consumers with cultivated meat, are there lessons we can take away? We hear advocates of cultivated meat talk about, it will be able to convince consumers in a few years that, this is even cleaner than, you mentioned it, industrial meat production, which I totally agree with you, by the way. But for the majority of consumers, do you think the cultivated meat industry needs to be a little bit more cautious in terms of what it assumes of them? Because a lot of folks are not going to be very familiar with this and are still going to think, oh, it's science fiction. How much will that impact consumer excitement on down the road?
Yeah, I think it's a particular challenge, that the consumer messaging around this technology, because with plant-based meat, I think you can make a compelling health message. I think that's a little bit harder with cultivated meat. I mean, there are some companies talking about switching the fatty acid profile, for example, but again, that's kind of down the road. In the short term, if you're combining a few cultivated chicken cells with some soy protein and making a nugget, I'm not sure that you're making a very compelling health argument. And if you are, it's probably coming from the plant-based side of it rather than the cultivated side of it. I think the kind of antibiotic-free message may resonate in the kind of the cleaner environment. But again, there are those kind of messaging is available in existing meat products. You can buy antibiotic-free or more premium meat products already. So again, I'm not sure that that's going to be hugely distinctive, at least in the short term, for the consumer. So as for sustainability, we've seen that doesn't seem to really sell in many markets, right? So again, I'm not sure that's going to sell, at least in the short term. So then you get to the ethical arguments. Again, we've seen in the plant-based sector that isn't compelling for a large number of consumers. And let's face it, cultivated meat initially is going after the mainstream consumer or the flexitarian consumer, and not the vegan or vegetarian consumer. Maybe some ethical vegans, if you like. So I honestly don't really know what the proposition is for the consumer right now. And I think the industry is still trying to work out what that is. At scale, it makes sense, right? If you can really produce real meat, why wouldn't you switch, right? And you can make it without animals. But in the short term, how do you get there?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a case to be made that the assumptions about the consumer demand were way off, and added to the hype around this category, the whole meat category. Okay, Jenn, what has been some of your key takeaways from 2025?
Yeah, well, I guess we can start with, I mean, on a high level, it's been a pretty up and down and tumultuous year for climate. I think, we've seen a lot of folks, just from a political regulatory perspective, a lot of people backing out of climate smart initiatives. Elaine, you just mentioned, sustainability is not a selling point for consumers in most cases. We see brands really backing away from that, choosing alternative messaging to relate to consumers because they're just not gaining any attention with the sustainability argument. We could go in a lot of directions as far as climate and sustainability goes, but I'm going to zero in here on regenerative agriculture and what has sort of happened this year, because we got arguably the biggest development, at least from a regulatory perspective, just earlier, last week, which was the U.S. Department of Agriculture announced a regenerative agriculture pilot. It's worth about $700 million. And its purpose is to help farmers in the U.S. adopt regenerative practices, cover cropping, no-till, low-till, grazing, rotational, crop rotation, etc. So that obviously caused a huge stir on the internet. And, I thought a great way to just kind of recap the sort of spectrum of thoughts about that is, we've covered it extensively on AFN and heard a lot of people talk about it. Folks are excited. Some folks say that this is going to advance and accelerate pathways to regenerative agriculture for farmers. It's going to give them access to the capital they need to transition, which is, as anyone following the space knows, it's a massive barrier. It's still the number one barrier for most folks wanting to transition to regenerative farming. There's also some concerns about it, though. The Natural Resources Conservation Service is the one administering this pilot program. Well, they were part of the massive cuts to staffing and funding that happened not so long ago. And so we have heard some folks say, if you really want to make this regenerative pilot program a reality, you need to restore the cut staff. You need to restore the funding. They won't be able to do it with working with the sort of bare bones operation that they have now. And I think there's also concern that about where the money will go. We saw with the Climate Smart Commodities program that a lot of that money went towards big companies, JBS, Tyson, et cetera. Really just reinforcing the consolidation that's happening right now and not really going towards the smaller operations who really arguably need that funding the most. So, there is that question of who's going to benefit the most from this. There have been questions raised about where does chemical crop protection, glyphosate, and don't worry, we'll get to glyphosate later, but, where does that fit in? It doesn't really fit into a truly regenerative food system, but we saw, addressing chemicals really got deprioritized with the MAHA report earlier this year. There's been some other moves by the government that really back up companies who are pushing those chemical products. So that's obviously another question around all this as well. I think, though, to look at this development, and it is the biggest development in regen this whole year, I believe, but to really look at it in context, I think we have to remember that it's brand new. It's a small scale pilot, and we just don't know at this point how it's going to impact farmers and who it's really going to benefit. I think the consensus that I'm hearing is we will be able to measure how successful a program like this is once we've got measurable outcomes. How much biodiversity did it restore? How much carbon did it capture? Did it, in fact, increase yields and therefore money going back to the farmers? So, I think it's a case of, it was a big announcement. Everyone has a lot to say about it, including myself. But it's like anything else having to do with regenerative agriculture, it's a long game. And we just are not going to know if this is successful for, I would say, at least a few years.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's really interesting about the timing of that is we've seen some other we've seen some fairly large funding deals for regen ag related technology companies. Obviously, there was Halter out of New Zealand, which raised, was it 100 million?
Yes.
No Fence raised a really sizable Series B, and I think there was another. I mean, these are all actually fenceless grazing technologies, essentially. And so I think it's interesting that you've had these actually ginormous deals. The Halter deal is massive at this time, and as you say, this is actually a pilot program. I mean, if you put it into the context of all USDA spending, it is microscopic. Not microscopic, but almost. I think I saw a chart the other day saying that spending on chemical agriculture was like 15 billion or something. And this is 700 million within that, and I'm sure there's errors with that comparison. But we're also seeing like the large corporations are increasing their commitments in regen ag, and when you speak with various people, they'll say, okay, these guys are legit with that. Some of them is still kind of a greenwashing thing. I think we have, with what you were saying around this retreat from climate, we have a bit of a recalibration at some of these corporations who, some of them have somewhat, I think, admittedly sort of behind the scenes, said that some of this was a bit of a marketing ploy to say they're doing these regen ag initiatives. But oftentimes, they've actually hired in some really great people who are true kind of believers in the regen ag transition, which has actually made some meaningful change. So it is an exciting time, I think, in terms of funding. And if you look at more broadly outside of the tech space as well, funding to regen ag initiatives, whether that's kind of real assets or farmland transition plays and so on, does seem to be continuing to increase. So it's interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we've also seen some interesting models for investing in these farmers emerge. Mad Capital, which is a subsidiary of Mad Agriculture, they do pretty, they really are, and I believe they raised this year as well, I think it was 78 million, to help farmers access capital and access what they need to transition. There's another group in Chicago or Illinois area called Iroquois Valley that specializes in long-term leases for farmers, long-term, with the idea being that short-term farm leases, a year, 2 years tops, you can't prepare for you can't restore the soil on a short-term farm lease. So Iroquois Valley has created this system where they get investments. That investment then goes into these providing these long-term leases, enabling farmers in the U.S. to really hone in on true regeneration. So I think going forward, we will continue to see a lot of focus on lease length, on investing in sort of the natural capital, which is a part of regen ag. I think, 3 years ago, I went around at an event in London and asked people to define natural capital, and no one could. And this year, people are actually kind of affixing really clear ideas to it of what that is.
Yeah, and one of the things that we've been doing a bit internally, and we're still hoping to produce a report related to it, is is funding levels into regen agtech, which is obviously difficult when there's no one solid definition around it. We don't want to get into that debate, but I think it, it is interesting to see how that does, feed down into the technology space as well. One area that maybe we could get onto is the ag biologicals market, because that is oftentimes related to regen ag, and what have we seen in that market this year? Sticking with you, Jenn, you've written a few pieces. We've done some kind of investment related pieces based on the market mapping that the folks at Mixing Bowl have done for us. Any kind of core takeaways from that space before we move on to looking at 2026?
Yeah, absolutely. We saw, so the biostimulants category, Dunham Trimmer, who is pretty much the number one market research firm in terms of tracking, they've been tracking the biological space for years. And they released a report recently, and biostimulants in particular are still growing as a category, and still strong. Latin America is leading that category and leading, pretty much all the categories in biologicals, biostimulants, biofertilizer, biopesticides. Brazil in particular has a regulatory setup that really enables companies to bring products to market and get them out in the field. We have some of that in the US, and then Europe, of course, has a lot of hurdles, a very long regulatory period. So I think the growth of biological sort of is inherently tied to what the regulations in different regions are and how long it takes companies to get through the pipeline there. I think it's the sector. I think one question everybody's asking as we go into 2026 is, there's a ton of companies. I mean, if you look at the Mixing Bowl's wonderful market maps that they do, I mean, the biostimulants category, it got, I think, around 100 more companies between 2024 and 2025 when they unveiled the latest. But people are still asking, is this an investable category? Is this something that it could actually generate sort of, especially when you look at VC, can these products, which can take years and years and years to develop and test and actually get to market, bring the kind of returns that VCs are looking for? And I think we have yet to sort of get a solid answer for that. I think I have definitely spoken to investors who are wary of the category, a bit dubious about, whether or not it's something that folks should be putting their money into. At the same time, there's a bigger push from consumers, from certain regulatory bodies, from the regen ag sector, all this pushing for cleaner crop protection solutions. I'm sure we'll get into the whole Bayer glyphosate thing a bit later, but there is opportunity. It's a matter of, can startups get these products to work with the same level of efficacy as some of the chemical counterparts, and can they do that at a price point that makes sense for the farmers? I think those are the two biggest things.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that question around, is venture capital the right type of capital for many different categories in agri-food-tech is something that a lot of our peers are often asking, and there are lots of other great podcasts where you can listen to that debate being rolled out. Sarah Nolet, for example, Shane Thomas, I know they've been talking a lot about this as a theme, and I think that it's almost something that could be relevant for the cultivated meat space as well when you think about those timelines. Is that suitable for venture capital? So let's move on to what we're looking at for 2026. And Elaine, I know you've got a fairly healthy list of what you're going to be tracking next year.
So yeah, obviously GLP-1 drugs. I think that's going to be fascinating area to watch. It's hard to know whether this is a kind of a food tech or an investable opportunity, or just something that's going to affect the food industry more broadly, though. And a lot of it really depends on things beyond the industry's control, which is, access to the drugs, insurance, and things like that. So, but, clearly if 20-30% of the population ends up on these drugs, that is going to have a massive effect on the food industry and the products people buy. I think the food industry at the moment is still trying to navigate how to respond to that trend. So some companies are looking at, companion products for people that are on these drugs or trying to wean themselves off, or maybe deal with the nausea, the kind of GI issues. And obviously adding protein to absolutely everything, which most Americans are not sure of. And then there's separately a kind of tech angle, if you like, where you've got companies that are looking to see if they can mimic the effects of these drugs. I think the jury is still out on those companies. Do you try and do things that naturally stimulate these hormones, in which case it's not likely to be anything like as effective as drugs, or do you do something that kind of mimics these drugs, engages the receptors? So I'm watching that space quite closely. One area that I've been following quite closely is the so-called animal-free dairy space, which is where companies are using microbes to produce, real dairy proteins in fermentation tanks. We've just seen Perfect Day, the biggest player in this space, raised $825 million to get this technology off the ground, and they've got a plant that's going to be up and running late next year in India. So excited to see that. But I think what's really fascinating about this space is how many players are now shifting and pivoting to a more premium offering. So we're seeing companies that are functionalizing proteins. We're seeing them switch from commodity proteins like whey and casein, if you like, to lactoferrin. And we're seeing people moving to high value proteins that are in breast milk. And I'm seeing this right across the food tech sector as well. So I am seeing also this in indoor farming. Again, very challenging space, but maybe players that are in saffron or vanilla are going to make more money than players who are trying to do kind of lettuce. Other things in the kind of political space, I suppose, where's the whole debate about ultra processed foods going? It looks like we're going to get a federal definition at some point. And if we get a definition, how is that going to influence policy? And also, will we have warning labels on processed foods going forward at a federal level? Obviously, following the Maha movement, where is that going? I think in the immediate term, it's kind of just meant people continuing that clean label trend, if you like, which does present opportunities, again, for companies looking for more natural preservatives, colours, flavours and so on, some of which you can produce through precision fermentation quite effectively. So that's kind of interesting space to watch. I'm obviously looking at AI. This is going to affect every single segment in Agrifoodtech, in protein discovery, new product development, consumer sentiment, assessing meat quality in real time. There's a big funding around in that space this week. Anything and everything. I'm quite interested personally in plant cell culture. Using plant cells rather than microbial cells to produce certain ingredients that you just can't produce in a yeast cell, for example. And I think there's a particular opportunity there in high value botanicals, for which there's already an established nutraceutical market. We're just switching to a more consistent production method. Rubisco, I'm always interested to see whether this is finally going to be 2026. Is that the year that Rubisco, which is this protein found in all the leaves of all plants, is that going to finally take off? I'm also kind of looking at biomanufacturing. This one of the challenges over the last few years has been access to capacity in this space. If you're trying to scale up in the biomanufacturing space, no VC is going to fund the capex for you to build a $100, $200 million plant anymore. So how do you get from A to B? And it was historically a challenge accessing CMOs, and there was really long lead times and so on. But there is more capacity becoming available now, both in the US, India, and some other markets. So I think that is going to help players in the sector kind of scale up. And the other kind of things I'm looking at are actually in Jenn's area, which is livestock methane reduction and drones.
Yeah, great. I mean, you've done some fantastic coverage of drones, just picking up on that last point, and everything that's been going on around DJI being, it's close to being banned.
There's been multiple efforts through by lawmakers to try and restrict their activities in the US market. It looks like they are going to be effectively shut out the market unless there's some kind of 11th hour deal that we can see. They're going to be effectively shut out the market for new models next year, and potentially we're going to see the revocation of existing licenses as well. So it's going to be interesting to see what that means for the domestic drone sector. There are many more players kind of coming up, although many of them do actually buy parts from China. which, and again, these parts could be subject to the same kind of restrictions. And then on top of that, you've got tariffs as well. So it's going to be really interesting to see what happens in that space 2026.
Right, exactly. And then on Ozempic, I mean, or on GLP-1s, yeah, very interested about that. I mean, overall, just the reframing of the food industry that comes with it. But I'm also wondering, I see things cropping up, and I don't know if many of them are actually founded yet, but about, long-term side effects of using some of these drugs, and if there's going to be anything coming out around that. I mean, someone sent me something the other day about, causing blindness or something, and I'm sure a lot of this is very rare cases, but I do think that there's still some long-term impacts that might be coming out.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, the drugs actually have been available for the diabetic consumer for many years before we all kind of came across them for weight loss. So they have actually been in the market, and you have people that have been on them for many years. Some of those kind of the GI effects, for again, from people that I've been talking to, it seems like the next generation of these drugs, which hit multiple receptors, not just GLP-1, they could potentially be better tolerated as well, which again will presumably mean that people are more likely to stay on these drugs. But I think one of the issues I'm interested in is the longer term effects of cycling on and off these drugs on your metabolism.
Directly tied to that conversation as well about UPFs and health, and building programs for folks that can support them while they're on these drugs to create better habits, to understand more about the food they're putting in their bodies, why it might be increasing weight gain, and so on and so forth. I don't know, Elaine, do you get a sense that there's an effort to kind of pair that more addressing lifestyle and choices with these drugs?
Yeah, so I did a recent kind of online kind of event like this with them about GLP-1, and Dr. Ryan Kane at Tufts University is looking at this specific issue about wraparound support for people on these drugs, which, as you say, is absolutely critical because, anecdotally, we all know people. I know people that are taking these drugs and are subsisting on a coffee and one bagel a day, which they're quite happy, they're losing all the weight, but this doesn't seem to be very healthy or sustainable.
Okay, Jenn, to finish up, tell us about what you're looking at in 2026.
Absolutely. Well, I too am very interested in the whole ultra processed foods and the GLP-1 and how that evolves within AgTech. We saw a lot of funding rounds go towards agrobotics and automation this year, and we will see more of that, I suspect, all over the world, not just in the US, and across specialty crops and broadacre row crops. Louisa, you mentioned virtual fencing, which I think we're going to see lots and lots of next year. It very interesting in the sense that it does tie into the regenerative ag conversation because it makes rotational grazing a little bit easier, but it's also a herd management tool, being able to monitor movement of your herd, see if there's a problem without having to actually be in the field. That varies from company to company, but that's definitely one of the major pluses of that. So the virtual fencing, and on a basic level, it's in a lot of cases cheaper than building miles and miles and miles of fence line, which has become, frightfully expensive in this day and age. So we will see more of that. And then I think along the lines of biologicals, I think AI is a huge component there when we're thinking about how companies are using AI to speed up the process of discovery in ag biologicals. So another sector that, like alternative protein, has had a very tumultuous year is vertical farming. And we've got some bookends going on. Close to the beginning of the year, we saw Plenty, massive, raised over $400 million from really high profile people. They closed their doors, and then just literally this week, Aero Farms, which is another, just raised tons of money, unicorn status, all that. They, after a very, very long process, have finally announced that they have closed up their last will be closing their last plant and terminating all of the staff permanently, including the C-suite folks. So AeroFarms is really the last of those giant vertical farming players that won over these generalist investors back from about 2020 on up to 2022, 23. So, in some ways it isn't surprising at all, the AeroFarms news, and it's sort of just the punctuation mark on all of this long drawn out death sentence for vertical farming. But I don't think it actually is a death sentence. Elaine, to your point, there's some very interesting things happening with growing much, much higher value crops.
Yes.
Vanilla, saffron, seedlings, even nursery seedlings, so not even food, but your nursery plants and things like that. Potato seedlings have been successfully grown there. So I think we're going to continue to hear about vertical farming and into next year, but it's not going to be this huge, wow, these are going to change agriculture and save the planet and all. None of them are, and they all know that. But this is a very, this is a use of technology that has its place in farming. And I think now that the hype is well and truly dead, we can now begin to see the real possibilities. And I'll end with, another piece that's been in the news a lot this year and is definitely going to be front and center next year is Bayer and glyphosate, Roundup. We had quite a few things happen this year with regards to the situation around glyphosate. The biggest ones, we saw a paper that was published 25 years ago get retracted. And this is a paper that has, over the last quarter of a century, been cited by regulators as being, evidence of the safety of glyphosate. Well, the journal that originally published that paper back in 2000 retracted the paper. In a nutshell, it's been revealed that Monsanto, which Bayer acquired, and Monsanto is the original maker of Roundup, had basically ghostwritten the paper. But what's interesting is the timing of this paper happened just as Bayer urged the United States Supreme Court to review its 67,000, I think is the number, lawsuits it is currently facing from people claiming that Roundup caused them cancer. So Bayer's asked the Supreme Court to renew and curtail a lot of this legislation. We don't need to go into the nitty-gritty legal jargon of all that, but suffice to say, this is going to be a big deal going into next year. We've seen the Trump administration kind of back Bayer on this. And it's really, how the Supreme Court decides this could say a lot in terms of the future of glyphosate. I think it's also worth noting that the EPA's 15-year renewal of glyphosate, so this happens every 15 years, is under final review. It was supposed to happen already, but now it's, with the cuts and kind of the upheaval, it's been delayed. And so that decision on keeping it registered, keeping the product registered is supposed to happen in 2026. So, a lot of questions around what's the future of this particular product that could be incredibly harmful, whilst others say it's not harmful at all. I think we'll see debate on that just pick up even more.
Great. Okay. So, to finish up, I'll just kind of share a little bit about what I'm interested in based off of what you guys have been talking about. I think, you mentioning, Jen, around the role of AI in discovery and R&D. And that is something that I find particularly interesting. And flying the AgFunder flag for a minute, we have a company called Atinary, who has got some really exciting developments coming up next year with a self-driving robotic lab. And they can accelerate R&D about 100x. And they are working with various food and agriculture companies. So, that is definitely a space to watch. We think they're one of the one of the leading, if not the leading players in that space. And so I absolutely agree. How is that going to change the landscape for some of these very research intensive categories of agtech and food tech, and can that make them more investable, as you say? So I think that is come to market more quickly. That's really exciting. And then I have sort of been tracking a bit the rollout of AI in some of the large corporations. I think the debate around the culture of AI and the data readiness that corporations have to adopt some of these tools at scale. You know, we've definitely had a sort of hype moment around AI. And if you look at overall venture capital dollars, AI is eating all the venture capital dollars. In the US, it's, you know, north of 60-70% of all venture capital. We've actually seen that pull capital away from Agrifoodtech, as many of the more generalist VCs have kind of closed down some of their sector specific departments just to go all in on AI. And so I think something that's going to be key and interesting for the agri-food industry is to see how we can still make use of some of that innovation. You know, it doesn't necessarily have to be built for agri-food tech. It can be built for other industries and be brought into agri-food. And I think that would be something key for the industry to be considering. Anyway, we've gone far longer than we thought we were going to go. There's a lot to talk about. There's plenty that we haven't said, but we want to thank our readers, you know, for reading AgFunderNews this year. Let us know what you think. Let us know what you want us to write about and report on next year. Our research report, our global report, is coming out. Let us know what you want to see in that. And wishing you all very happy holidays and all the best for 2026.